The auctioneer's gavel pounded like a judge's sentence against the makeshift wooden platform, each strike echoing off the false front buildings of Cedar Flats like gunshots in a canyon. Lot 17, girl, maybe 20, can't speak a lick, but she's strong enough for kitchen work. His voice carried over the desperate crowd gathered in the settlement's dusty square, where broken dreams came to die and families sold off pieces of themselves to survive another Colorado winter. She stood there in the harsh autumn sun of 1878, threadbare shawl pulled tight around shoulders that refused to bow despite months of her family's shame. Her father counted silver coins from earlier sales without meeting her eyes, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he fingered the money that would keep wolves from his door for another season. The men in the crowd circled like buzzards over carrion, making crude jokes about what she'd be good for, even if she couldn't talk back to complain about their intentions. From the back of the crowd, heavy boots crunched on gravel and dried leaves. The mountain man stepped forward, silver dollars glinting in his sun-darkened palm like promises of salvation. "I'll take her," Tom Brennan said quiet-like, but his voice carried over the jeering crowd with the kind of natural authority that comes from 15 years of making the high country listen to reason. The auctioneer's grin showed tobacco-stained teeth that matched his moral character. "Well now, looks like even broken merchandise finds a buyer willing to take the risk." Tom's jaw tightened as he counted out the coins, his life savings, every dollar earned through blood and sweat in the thin air above the tree line. As he reached up to help her down from the platform, she pulled back suddenly, brown eyes wide with something that might have been fear of him or recognition of something deeper running between them like an underground stream. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if the strange transaction would hold or collapse like so many other desperate bargains made in desperate times. The walk through Cedar Flats felt like running a gauntlet constructed from whispers and sideways glances. Every step Tom and the girl took toward his weathered wagon stirred up fresh gossip that followed them like crows after a fresh-killed deer, dark and persistent and hungry for something to pick clean. "That's the mute one," old Mrs. Fletcher hissed from her general store doorway, her voice carrying the particular venom that only comes from years of disappointment fermented into bitterness. "Been nothing but trouble since the fever took her voice when she was small. Her daddy's been trying to unload her for months now, ever since the pretty daughters got sold off to them railroad men heading west. Family's got gambling debts clear to Denver," another voice added from the shadows between buildings. "Had to sell the 2 pretty daughters first. Got good money for them, too, what with their yellow hair and sweet dispositions. This one's all that's left, and ain't nobody wanted damaged goods until today." Tom kept his eyes fixed forward on the rutted street, but he noticed how the girl's head tilted slightly at each cruel word, like a deer testing the wind for danger. She wasn't simple-minded like they all claimed. She was listening, understanding, filing every piece of cruelty away behind those alert brown eyes that missed nothing and forgot less. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and Tom found himself studying those shadows more than the faces of the townspeople. Something about the way certain men positioned themselves, the way conversations died when he approached, the way hands drifted toward gun belts when they thought he wasn't looking. Cedar Flats had always been a hard town, but there was a new kind of tension in the air, thick as smoke from green wood. At Fletcher's general store, they loaded winter supplies, while more poisonous chatter swirled around them like leaves before a storm. Tom's reputation preceded him like a shadow cast by firelight, growing larger and more distorted with each telling. "Lives alone up there above the timberline," someone muttered from behind barrels of flour and beans. Ain't come down from that mountain in 2 winters running. What's a hermit want with a woman, especially a broken one that can't even thank him proper? Old Prospector Pete ambled over, tobacco juice staining his gray beard the color of old copper. His rheumy eyes held the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving 40 years in country that kills the weak and unlucky with equal efficiency. "Taking on damaged goods, Tom," he said, low enough that only Tom could hear over the store's bustle. "That girl's got shadows following her, mark my words. Some shadows got teeth." The girl stood silent by the wagon, while Tom loaded supplies, but he saw how she studied every face in the crowd, with the kind of careful attention he'd learned watching for sign in dangerous country. Her eyes moved constantly, cataloging expressions of contempt or curiosity, measuring distances to doors and alleys, reading the room like a hunter reads tracks in fresh snow. When the storekeeper's wife made a particularly cutting remark about what passes for Christian charity these days, the girl's fingers tightened on her shawl until her knuckles showed white as bleached bone, but her spine stayed straight as a lodgepole pine. Whatever had broken her voice hadn't broken her spirit. The wagon creaked and groaned as they started up the mountain trail, leaving the settlement's accumulated cruelty behind with each turn of the iron-shod wheels. The higher they climbed into the thin air, the more Tom noticed the tension draining from her small frame like water from a broken dam. Her shoulders lost their defensive hunch, and for the first time since stepping onto that auction platform, she drew a breath that seemed to reach all the way down to her toes. "Road gets rough from here on out," Tom said, more to break the silence than because she needed warning about what lay ahead. She nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that somehow felt like the first real communication they'd shared since money changed hands in the valley below. The trail wound through stands of aspen already touched with autumn's gold brush, their leaves whispering secrets in the thin mountain air. Then it climbed into the darker pines, where the temperature dropped 10 degrees, and the world took on the cathedral silence that comes with altitude and solitude. She turned once to look back at the valley below, where smoke from the settlement's chimneys rose straight up in the still air like prayers from desperate souls. When she faced forward again, something in her expression had shifted. Not quite hope, but maybe the absence of the particular kind of fear that comes from being surrounded by people who wish you harm. Up here, the only dangers were honest ones: weather, wild animals, and the simple challenge of staying alive in country that didn't care about human troubles. They were almost to the last bend before his cabin when she suddenly grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked like a stiff wind might blow her away. She pointed to the muddy ground beside the trail, where boot prints showed clear as day in the soft earth, prints that didn't match Tom's worn soles, prints that had no business being on his private mountain. "Someone's been watching the place," Tom said, more to himself than to her, but when he looked at her face, he saw that she'd already figured that out. Her eyes had gone wide with something deeper than simple concern, something that looked almost like recognition. Somebody had been up at his cabin while he was gone, making themselves comfortable in his sanctuary. Somebody who now knew exactly what he'd brought home from the valley, and might have opinions about his recent purchase that wouldn't be expressed in polite conversation. The cabin sat in a small clearing carved from the mountainside by axe and determination, built solid against a granite outcrop that had stood since the world was young and would likely stand until it grew old and tired. Smoke curled peaceful-like from the stone chimney, but Tom knew he hadn't left a fire burning when he'd ridden down to Cedar Flats that morning. Someone had been inside his sanctuary, making themselves comfortable among his few possessions. She followed him up the porch steps with the silent grace of someone who'd learned that noise could bring unwanted attention. Her bare feet made no sound on the weathered boards that Tom had hewn himself from pines that had grown straight and true in the thin mountain air. When he pushed open the heavy oak door with his rifle ready for whatever might be waiting inside, they found the interior empty but violated in ways that made Tom's teeth clench. Nothing had been stolen, nothing broken in the obvious way, but everything sat just slightly out of place in the manner that tells a careful man his sanctuary ain't sacred anymore. The coffee pot moved 2 inches from its usual spot, books rearranged on their shelf. His spare blanket refolded with creases that didn't match his own careful habits. "Was 3 of them," Tom said, studying the muddy prints on his clean floor with the practiced eye of someone who'd tracked everything from deer to desperate men. "Stayed long enough to eat my food and go through my things proper. Made themselves right at home while they were about it." He looked at her pressed against the far wall, saw the way she'd positioned herself with her back to solid logs and clear sight lines to both door and window. She wasn't just scared, she was thinking tactically, like someone who'd learned survival in a hard school where graduation meant staying breathing. "You know who they were?" Tom asked, though her expression had already given him the answer. She nodded once, terror flickering in her eyes like candlelight in wind, but beneath the fear lay something else, a kind of grim recognition that said this moment had been coming for a long time, and she'd been preparing for it even if she'd hoped it might never arrive. Tom set his rifle back on its wooden pegs above the stone fireplace and turned to face her properly, giving her his full attention in the way that mountain silence teaches a man to do. "Listen here, girl. I got a spare room back there with a good strong door and a window that looks east toward the sunrise. It's yours for as long as you need it, whether that's a day or a decade. No strings attached, no expectations beyond common courtesy." He paused, searching for words that would carry the weight of what he meant without frightening her further. "You ain't property, whatever that paper down in town might have said. You ain't livestock to be bought and sold, and you sure ain't some prize to be won. You're a human being with your own mind and your own choices, and anybody who says different will have to discuss the matter with me and my rifle." For the first time since the auction platform, something resembling trust flickered across her face like morning light touching a deep pool. She moved through his small home with careful respect, touching his few possessions like they were made of spun glass and fairy dreams. A tin cup worn smooth by years of use. A Bible with pages soft as cloth from countless readings. The daguerreotype photograph on the rough-hewn shelf that served as his shrine to what he'd lost and couldn't forget. When she saw the picture, a woman and small child posed stiff and formal in their Sunday best, she stopped moving entirely. Her fingers hovered over the cracked glass like she was afraid her touch might shatter more than just the image, and for a moment Tom thought she might speak. Instead, she looked at him with such complete understanding that words would have been as unnecessary as explaining sunrise to someone who'd watched it paint the peaks gold every morning for 20 years. She knew about loss. She knew about the particular weight of memories that follow a person into the high country, growing heavier with each step away from civilization and its comfortable distractions. She understood why a man might choose to live alone on a mountain peak, why he might trade the company of the living for conversations with ghosts who never argued back or asked for more than he could give. "That was my wife Emma and our boy James," Tom said, his voice rougher than he'd intended, like he'd swallowed mountain gravel. Fever took them both while I was off hunting meat for winter. Been 5 years now, and some days it feels like 50, other days like it just happened yesterday morning. She touched the photograph once, gently, like she was offering a prayer for strangers she'd never meet, but whose absence she could feel in the careful way Tom had arranged his small shrine. Then she looked at him with eyes that said she understood completely why a man might need silence and solitude to heal from wounds that went deeper than anything visible on the surface. That first night, as darkness settled over the clearing like a familiar blanket, strange sounds drifted up from the valley on the thin air that carried voices and secrets farther than it had any right to. Tom heard horses moving on the trail below, hoofbeats ringing against stone in the particular rhythm of riders who knew where they were going and weren't concerned about announcing their presence to anyone who might be listening. Someone was asking questions about the mountain man's recent purchase, and from the tone of the distant voices, Tom had a growing certainty that the answers wouldn't sit well with the kind of men who preferred their business conducted in shadows and silence. He checked his rifle one more time before settling into his chair by the fire, the familiar weight of the weapon a comfort in his hands. Through the thin wall that separated his main room from the spare bedroom, he could hear her moving quietly, probably as sleepless as he was. Whatever trouble had followed her up his mountain, morning would bring it closer to his door, and he'd need to be ready for whatever form that trouble might take. When Tom woke at first light, his rifle was gone from above the fireplace. The spare room door stood open, showing rumpled blankets and an empty space where she should have been sleeping safe. Then gunshots echoed from the ridge above the cabin, sharp and angry in the mountain stillness that usually held nothing more violent than the call of hunting hawks. Had she taken his weapon and run into the timber? Or was something far worse than a frightened girl waiting among the pines? The gunshots turned out to be Tom hunting winter meat. But the way she'd feared the worst showed him depths of trauma that ran deeper than mountain springs. When he came back with a deer slung across his broad shoulders, she was standing in the cabin doorway with a poker from the fireplace clutched in both small hands, ready to fight whatever came through the tree line with nothing but iron and determination. "Easy there," he said, setting down his burden and raising both hands in a gesture of peace. "Just putting food by for when the snow flies. Winter comes early up here, and it don't ask permission before it decides to stay a while." Her relief was so complete that her knees nearly buckled under the sudden absence of tension she'd been carrying like a packful of stones. She set the poker aside with hands that shook like aspen leaves in wind, and Tom realized she'd spent the entire morning convinced he'd either abandoned her to whatever fate awaited or been killed trying to protect her from dangers she understood better than he did. The thought of her alone in that cabin, listening to every forest sound and expecting violence to emerge from the shadows between the pines, made something fierce and protective stir in his chest like a bear waking from winter sleep. That afternoon, while he butchered the deer with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been feeding himself from the wilderness for 15 years, she appeared at his elbow with strips of clean cloth and a basin of water warmed over the fire. Without a word or gesture of explanation, she began tending the small cuts on his hands from knife work, her touch gentle as morning rain on drought-dry ground. It had been 5 years since anyone had cared for him with that particular combination of competence and tenderness, and the simple kindness nearly undid him completely. His throat tightened with emotions he'd thought buried deep as mine shafts, and for a moment he couldn't trust his voice to work properly. "You don't need to," he started, but she gave him a look that said she understood exactly what she was doing and why. Her care wasn't offered from obligation or fear of consequences, if she failed to please. It was freely given, one wounded soul recognizing another and offering what healing lay within her power to provide. Over the following days, as autumn painted the mountainsides in shades of gold and crimson that made the air itself seem to glow, they developed their own language that had nothing to do with spoken words. Tom taught her the hand signals he'd learned from Ute traders during his early years in the territory, warnings for bear sign, approaching storms, or strangers moving through country where they had no honest business being. She learned with the quick intelligence of someone whose survival had always depended on reading signs that others missed. And soon she was adding gestures of her own, building a vocabulary of communication that served them better than most married couples managed with years of conversation. Her signals were graceful and precise, like watching someone paint meaning in the air with movements that carried more information than paragraphs of speech. The first time he made her laugh was purely by accident, and the sound hit him like unexpected sunshine breaking through storm clouds. She'd been watching his morning routine with the careful attention of someone learning the rhythms of a new life, the way he scratched his graying beard while staring at the coffee pot as if he could make it brew faster through pure concentration, the elaborate stretching ritual he performed to work the stiffness from joints that had accumulated 45 years of hard living, the muttered complaints he directed at inanimate objects that failed to cooperate with his expectations. When she started mimicking his movements with theatrical exaggeration, complete with his habitual scowl and the particular way he talked to his boots like they were misbehaving children, Tom couldn't help but chuckle. The sound surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise her. Then she smiled, and that smile transformed her entire face from careful wariness to something approaching joy, like watching winter give way to spring in the span of a heartbeat. They took their meals together at his small table, something Tom insisted on despite her repeated attempts to serve him, and eat, standing like a servant, waiting for permission to breathe. "We're partners in this arrangement," he told her, with the firmness of a man stating natural law. "Partners sit together, eat together, and share whatever burdens the day might bring." During those quiet evenings by the fire, when the only sounds were the settling of logs and the distant call of night birds, he began to understand that whatever had stolen her voice had left her with something else in return, a way of seeing that cut straight through pretense to the truth of things. She watched him work with eyes that catalogued not just his actions, but his motivations, learning his routines not to serve him better, but to anticipate his needs and offer help before he knew to ask for it. When his old war injury made his shoulder ache with weather changes, she'd quietly warm a cloth over the fire and bring it to him without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. When loneliness threatened to pull him back toward the whiskey bottle he kept hidden behind the flour sacks like a shameful secret, she'd find some small task that required both their hands, drawing him into partnership that made solitary drinking feel like betrayal of their growing bond. But she wasn't the only one carrying secrets that weighed heavy as winter snow on pine branches. Tom had been wrestling with his own demons for years, and that bottle in the corner had been his closest companion through the worst nights when memories of Emma and James came calling like wolves, howling outside the door. When she found it one evening, lifting the brown glass from its hiding place with the careful handling reserved for dangerous things, Tom felt shame burn through him like winter wind through a crack in the cabin's chinking. "It ain't," he started, then stopped. Because what was the point of lying to someone who saw truth as clearly as she did? She held the bottle up to the lamplight, watching the amber liquid catch and throw back the flame, and when she looked at him, there was no judgment in her expression, only the same understanding she'd shown his family shrine. But understanding didn't make the shame hurt less, didn't ease the particular pain that comes from being seen clearly by someone whose opinion has started to matter more than breath itself. Tom grabbed his coat and headed for the door, needing space and air and distance from those knowing eyes. "Need some air," he muttered, knowing it was a lie they both recognized. The blizzard building on the horizon looked like it might trap them together for days, and he couldn't face the thought of being seen so clearly by someone who was starting to mean everything to him. He disappeared into the gathering storm, leaving her alone with his shame and the approaching darkness that promised no easy mercy for fools who ran from their demons instead of facing them down. The blizzard hit the mountain like God's own fury given physical form, turning the familiar world into a howling white hell that tested even Tom's cabin, built to withstand anything the high country could throw at it. Snow drove horizontal through the air with enough force to strip bark from trees, and the wind screamed between the peaks like something alive and angry. By the time Tom stumbled back through the door, half frozen and delirious from more than just the cold, she was waiting with blankets warmed by the fire and hands steady enough to strip the ice from his clothes, despite the way his return had set her own hands to trembling. Her relief at seeing him alive was so fierce it burned in her eyes like stars reflecting off snow. For 3 days the storm raged while he burned with fever that had more to do with shame and whiskey than exposure to the elements, and she tended him like he was worth saving, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Through his delirium, Tom confessed things he'd never told another living soul, how he'd been away hunting when the fever took Emma and little James, how he'd found their bodies cold in the cabin he'd built to keep them safe from every danger except the one that mattered most. He told her about carrying their coffins up the mountain because he couldn't bear to leave them in the valley's rocky soil, about the way guilt had eaten at him like acid for 5 years, about how every sunset reminded him that he was still breathing while they were not. And through it all, she never left his bedside, cooling his fever with damp cloths and listening to his rambling confessions with the kind of patience that spoke of her own deep wounds and hard-won wisdom about the weight of secrets. When the worst of the fever passed, Tom found himself looking into eyes that had heard his darkest moments and somehow found him still worth the trouble of keeping alive. There was no pity in her gaze, no judgment for his failures, only the recognition of one survivor acknowledging another's pain without trying to minimize it or explain it away. On the second night of the storm, desperate knocking rattled the cabin door like something trying to claw its way inside. Tom was too weak to rise from his bed, but she helped him sit up as 3 men stumbled in from the blizzard, ice coating their beards and desperation carved into their faces by more than just weather. They claimed to be travelers caught by the storm, but Tom saw how her small body went rigid with terror when the lamplight showed their faces clearly. These weren't random wanderers seeking shelter. They were men she recognized, men whose presence in his cabin turned the very air poisonous with implications he was only beginning to understand. The strangers warmed themselves by his fire and ate his food while making casual conversation about the weather and the hard winter that was surely coming to test them all. But their eyes kept finding her where she huddled in the shadows, and Tom caught fragments of whispered talk that made his blood run cold as the storm outside. Thought she was dead for sure after what she saw that night. Family was paid well to keep their mouths shut and their daughter buried. Should have finished it then, instead of letting sentiment cloud good judgment. The third man, a well-dressed fellow with soft hands that had never known honest work and hard eyes that had seen too much dishonest business, studied her like she was a puzzle he was working to solve. When he spoke, His voice carried the kind of educated authority that made threats sound like reasonable conversation. "Girl can't talk, can she? That's what makes her so useful to certain parties. Dead women tell no tales, but mute ones are almost as good, assuming they stay mute." His smile never reached his eyes. Silence is a virtue, they say, especially in women who've seen things they shouldn't have seen, heard words that could hang important men. When dawn broke and the storm began to clear, the men made their polite excuses and prepared to leave his sanctuary as if their presence hadn't poisoned it permanently. But not before the soft-handed one leaned close to Tom's sickbed and spoke words that changed everything he thought he knew about the woman who'd been caring for him. "That girl ain't mute by birth, mountain man. Trauma stole her voice when she was 12 years old, saw something she wasn't supposed to see, heard words that could stretch necks if they ever reached the right ears. Her family sold her to us once before, thought we'd solve the problem permanent-like, but she slipped away in the night like smoke." His smile was winter cold and twice as deadly. "Won't happen again." Some problems require more permanent solutions than good intentions and family loyalty. After they left, the cabin felt poisoned by their presence, contaminated by threats that hung in the air like smoke from green wood. Tom looked at her with new understanding, seeing past the careful silence to the sharp intelligence beneath, recognizing that she hadn't lost her voice to fever or birth defect, but to fear. The kind of fear that comes from witnessing evil and understanding that knowledge is sometimes more dangerous than ignorance. That evening, as he struggled to sit up, despite the lingering weakness that made his limbs feel like water, she knelt beside his bed and did something that stopped his heart entirely. She opened her mouth, drew a breath that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul, and spoke his name in a voice rusty from disuse but clear as a church bell ringing across mountain valleys. "Tom?" It was barely a whisper, rough as creek gravel and uncertain as first ice, but it was the first sound she'd made in years, and she'd chosen to break her protective silence for him. The trust contained in that single word was worth more than all the silver in Colorado territory, more precious than anything he'd ever been given by another human being. But even as hope bloomed in his chest like wildflowers after rain, Tom knew those men would be back. They'd found her once, despite all her careful hiding, and they wouldn't give up easy on a problem that threatened whatever conspiracy they represented. Whatever she'd seen, whatever secret she carried locked behind years of protective silence, it was dangerous enough that men would follow her into the high country to make sure she never found her voice again. The storm had passed, but Tom could feel another one building on the horizon, one made of human greed and violence that would make the blizzard seem like a gentle spring rain by comparison. Morning brought old prospector Pete up the mountain trail with news that curdled Tom's blood like milk left too long in summer heat. Cedar Flats Church had burned to the ground during the night, taking with it not just the building, but the settlement's pretense of Christian charity toward those who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable behavior. "They're calling her unnatural, Tom," Pete said, warming his gnarled hands over coffee that had grown cold with worry and bitter with implications. "Saying a woman who can't speak proper words must be trafficking with dark spirits, Mrs. Fletcher's got half the town convinced that fire was Satan's own work, brought down on God-fearing folks by the presence of witchcraft on the mountain." Tom looked across the cabin at her, saw how she'd gone still as winter stone while listening to Pete's report. She understood every word of the poison being spread about her presence in their community, and the shame in her eyes made him want to ride down to Cedar Flats with his rifle and set a few things straight about Christian behavior and biblical teachings on treating strangers with kindness. But before he could voice his anger, hoofbeats announced more visitors approaching through the timber. Her father rode into the clearing with 3 well-dressed men whose expensive clothes and soft hands marked them as the kind of vultures who made their living picking over other people's desperation. They carried leather portfolios and official-looking papers, the tools of men who'd learned to use law books instead of guns to steal what they wanted from those too poor or ignorant to fight back effectively. Thomas Brennan, the lead man announced, dismounting from his fine horse with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I'm Attorney Morrison, representing certain business interests with legitimate claims in this territory. We're here about stolen property that's come into your possession through fraudulent means. The papers they spread across Tom's table looked official enough to fool most folks. All fancy stamps and flowing signatures and legal language that twisted and turned like smoke in wind. According to the documents, her father owed substantial gambling debts to a Denver syndicate, debts that had been settled through promises of his daughter's services to parties whose names were conveniently absent from the official record. And the transaction at Cedar Flats had been illegal from the start, Morrison explained, with the patient condescension of a schoolmaster correcting a slow student. She already belonged to other men by right of prior contract, bought and paid for through her father's markers in games of chance that had gone badly wrong for everyone except the house. "Course, we're reasonable fellows," Morrison continued, his smile sharp as a skinning knife and twice as dangerous. "We understand you acted in good faith, believing you were conducting legitimate business. Return the girl to her rightful owners, and there'll be no legal complications for anyone involved in this unfortunate misunderstanding." Tom's hand drifted instinctively toward his rifle, but Morrison raised a warning finger with the casual confidence of a man who held all the good cards in a crooked game. "Wouldn't advise violence, mountain man. We've got territorial law on our side, and Sheriff Dalton's riding up behind us with proper warrants signed by Judge Crawford himself. Best to handle this civilized-like." While the men talked their legal theft, she sat silent at the table, but her hands moved constantly, sketching on scraps of paper with quick, nervous strokes that seemed random until Tom caught sight of what she was drawing. They weren't the idle marks of a frightened mind, but detailed pictures that told stories no words could capture. Men in expensive suits standing over a body sprawled on wooden planks, a marshal's badge glinting in firelight, hands exchanging money while someone hung from a rope with their face covered by a flour sack. She was drawing testimony. Every line and shadow told a story of corruption and murder that went deeper than gambling debts or human trafficking. Whatever she'd witnessed years ago had been worth killing for, and these men had come to finish what they'd started before a 12-year-old girl's sharp eyes and excellent memory could bring their carefully constructed world crashing down around their ears. As afternoon wore toward evening, with the inevitability of seasons changing, more pressure arrived in waves designed to break whatever resistance Tom might be contemplating. Sheriff Dalton rode up with legal papers, demanding she be examined by the settlement's preacher to determine if she was fit for Christian society. Town women had signed a petition declaring her presence a threat to public morals and demanding her removal from decent company. Even Fletcher's General Store was refusing to sell supplies to anyone who harbored unnatural influences, effectively cutting Tom off from the resources he'd need to survive a mountain winter. The noose was tightening around their small sanctuary with the mechanical precision of a trap designed by men who understood that legal pressure could be more effective than bullets in most situations. As darkness fell over the peaks like a blanket woven from shadows and despair, she gathered her few possessions into the same small bundle she'd carried up the mountain. Through desperate gestures and increasingly frantic drawings, she tried to make Tom understand what her sacrifice would mean. She would leave to protect him from the storm gathering around her presence, disappear into the wilderness like smoke dissipating in wind. Her drawings showed the consequences of her staying. His cabin burned, his body hanging from the big pine that shaded his porch, herself dragged back to the kind of men who measured human worth in dollars and silence. But they also showed what her leaving might accomplish. His safety preserved, his mountain sanctuary returned to the peace it had known before her arrival. His life allowed to continue in the solitude he'd chosen over the complications that came with caring about another person's fate. Tom stepped between her and the door, his decision made with the finality of avalanche starting its unstoppable descent. "No," he said simply, taking the bundle from her hands and setting it back on the table. "Whatever's coming, whatever they're planning, we face it together. I've already lost one family to forces I couldn't control. I won't lose another." She shook her head frantically, pointing to her drawings of violence and corruption, trying to make him understand the depth of danger that followed her like a shadow cast by hellfire. But Tom had made his choice with the kind of certainty that comes from finally understanding what's worth fighting for. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the peaks gold and crimson, when armed men surrounded the cabin in a formation that spoke of military training and deadly intent. But these weren't local law enforcement or town vigilantes seeking frontier justice. These were the real buyers, the men who'd paid her father years ago and intended to collect their property regardless of who stood in their way or what collateral damage might result from their collection efforts. The men who emerged from the morning mist moved with the practiced efficiency of wolves who'd hunted together long enough to communicate without sound or gesture. They weren't settlers seeking justice or local law maintaining order. They were professional killers surrounding Tom's cabin like death itself had taken human form and decided to collect a debt that had been outstanding far too long. Their leader called out across the clearing in the crisp mountain air, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of being feared by men who thought they were dangerous. "Thomas Brennan, we know you're in there with our property. We've come to collect what rightfully belongs to us, and we're prepared to be reasonable about the terms of surrender." Tom took position at his front window, rifle ready, while she pressed herself against the log wall where the morning shadows offered some concealment. Through the glass, he counted at least 8 men positioned with military precision, each one armed with enough firepower to reduce his cabin to kindling and memory. The tactical situation wasn't promising for anyone who favored survival over principle. "Here's what's going to happen, Mountain Man," the leader continued, his tone suggesting this was merely a business transaction that had gotten unnecessarily complicated. "You're going to send out the girl, and we're going to pretend this unfortunate misunderstanding never occurred. Everyone walks away breathing, and winter finds you still warm by your fire instead of feeding the pine roots." Tom was preparing to shout back his refusal when she touched his shoulder with fingers that trembled like aspen leaves in storm wind. Her eyes were wide with recognition and something deeper than simple fear, the kind of knowledge that comes from witnessing evil firsthand and understanding that some men choose darkness not from desperation, but from preference for what it allows them to do to others. She moved to the window, looked out at the armed men positioned among the trees, and nodded, as if confirming a suspicion she'd carried for years like a stone in her heart. Then she did something that changed everything Tom thought he understood about their situation and the forces that had brought them together in this remote cabin where winter was gathering like an army preparing for siege. She opened her mouth and spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the cabin like a bell tolling judgment on men who'd thought their secrets were buried deeper than mountain roots. Federal Marshal William Hayes died August 15, 1875. His last words were, "Morrison's got blood money in Denver banks, and Judge Crawford's signature on every crooked deal from here to the territorial capital." The girl heard everything, every name, every amount, every crime we've been tracking for 2 years. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind in the pines and the sound of Tom's world rearranging itself around truths he'd never suspected. He stared at her, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place with the mechanical precision of a rifle bolt sliding home. She hadn't just witnessed a murder. She'd heard a dying federal marshal's complete testimony about corruption that reached from frontier settlements to territorial government offices. Her silence hadn't been protecting her from random violence, but from the systematic elimination of everyone who could testify to crimes that would hang judges and senators if they ever reached the right ears. Outside, the leader's voice had lost its casual confidence, taking on the sharp edge of a man whose careful plans had just developed fatal complications. "You should have stayed quiet, girl. Would have lived longer that way and saved everyone a lot of unnecessary trouble." But Tom was looking at her with eyes that saw connections he'd been blind to for months, understanding dawning like sunrise over peaks he'd thought he knew completely. "You're not just running from what you saw," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "You're protecting what you heard, carrying testimony that could bring down half the territorial government." She nodded, and for the first time since he'd known her, there was no fear in her expression. Only the kind of grim determination that comes from finally being ready to use weapons you've been saving for the right battle. Tom pulled his federal marshal's badge from its hiding place behind the family photograph, the star-shaped piece of metal that had gathered dust while he played mountain hermit and nursed wounds that had never properly healed. The badge caught the morning light as he pinned it to his shirt for the first time in 3 years. "William Hayes was my partner," he said, his voice carrying the authority of law that hadn't been corrupted by bribes or threats. "I've been hunting his killers ever since they put a bullet in his back and left him to die in a Denver alley. Been tracking leads and following rumors from mining camps to cattle towns, never knowing the key witness was sitting right here in my cabin." The revelation hung between them like smoke from a discharged weapon, changing everything about their situation and the forces that had brought them together. She'd witnessed his partner's murder and carried the dying man's testimony for years, while he'd been tracking the killers without knowing that justice depended on the voice of a woman who'd chosen silence over death. Storm clouds were building on the horizon again, dark and heavy with the promise of violence that would make the earlier blizzard seem like a gentle spring shower. Through the window, Tom could see the men taking positions for a siege that would end only when everyone inside the cabin was dead and buried where mountain winter would hide the evidence until spring. And she moved toward the cabin door, her small hand steady on the iron latch. Through urgent gestures and quickly sketched pictures, she made her intention crystal clear. She would surrender herself to save him, walk out there alone and face whatever they had planned rather than let him die for her secrets. But Tom caught her arm gently, his touch stopping her forward motion without force or desperation. "No," he said, with the finality of a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. "If we're going to end this, we end it right, together, with law and justice instead of bullets and shallow graves. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death, too much corruption, too much evil disguised as civilization. Then she nodded once, the gesture carrying all the weight of partnership forged in fire and tested by forces that would have broken weaker bonds. If this was their last stand, they'd make it count for something beyond mere survival. They'd make it count for justice, for the memory of a good marshal who'd died trying to clean up a territory where corruption had grown like cancer in healthy tissue. Outside, the leader's patience was wearing thin as morning frost under sun. The storm was coming, and with it, the reckoning that had been years in the making. "You've got until the wind changes, mountain man. Then we come in shooting, and whatever's left of you will feed the ravens until snow covers your bones." She stepped onto the cabin porch like a queen walking to her coronation, shoulders straight and chin high, despite the forest of rifle barrels trained on her heart with the precision of men who'd killed enough people to know where bullets did the most damage. The morning sun caught the threads of her worn shawl, transforming the threadbare cloth into something that seemed almost regal as she faced the men who'd hunted her across 3 territories and 5 years of running. "You boys look nervous," she said, her voice steady as the mountain stone beneath her feet, carrying clearly across the clearing to men who'd expected a frightened victim instead of a woman who could destroy them with words. "Must be hard work, being scared of one little girl who supposedly can't keep her mouth shut." The leader stepped forward from behind the pine that had been providing his cover, his expensive boots crunching on pine needles, and his smile cold as a January morning above the tree line. "We're going to take our time with you, girl. Going to make you scream loud enough to wake that dead marshal before we're finished. Going to teach you what happens to witnesses who think they can hide from justice forever." But she didn't flinch or step backward toward the safety of the cabin's thick walls. Instead, she began reciting names and dates, crimes and conspiracies, weaving a web of corruption that stretched from Denver boardrooms to territorial courthouses like a spider's web made of evidence and testimony that could hang men in expensive suits who thought themselves untouchable. Every word was a bullet aimed at powerful men who'd built fortunes on other people's graves, and Tom could see the psychological effect on the attackers as their leader's confidence cracked like ice under pressure. They'd expected to silence a frightened girl, not face down a woman who could recite chapter and verse of their crimes with the precision of a court stenographer. When the first shot rang out, fired more from frustration than tactical thinking, Tom was ready with his answering bullet that dropped the shooter before the echo faded from the canyon walls. Suddenly, the mountain exploded into violence as years of careful planning dissolved into chaos and desperation. The attackers had superior numbers and firepower, but Tom had something more valuable: intimate knowledge of every rock and tree around his cabin, every fold of ground that could provide cover, every natural advantage that 15 years of mountain living had taught him to exploit. The approaching storm provided additional cover as wind-driven clouds began to obscure the sun and change the light in ways that favored defenders over attackers. She directed him with hand signals that carried more tactical information than most military commanders managed with written reports, her keen eyes spotting threats and opportunities he might have missed in the chaos of combat. When one of the gunmen tried to flank their position using the creek bed for cover, her urgent gestures sent Tom to the right spot at exactly the right moment. From the forest came the sound of more riders approaching through the timber. Old Pete arriving with half the men from Cedar Flats, their eyes finally opened to the truth of who represented law and order in this conflict. The settlement folks had seen enough corruption in their lives to recognize it when it was laid bare, and they'd chosen to stand with the federal marshal instead of the men who'd been bleeding their community dry through crooked deals and intimidation. "Took you long enough," Pete called out as he took cover behind Tom's woodshed, his ancient rifle speaking with the authority of a man who'd survived 40 years in country that killed the unprepared and unlucky. Town figured it was past time to choose sides in this particular dance. The battle raged through the morning as storm clouds built overhead, turning the peaceful clearing into chaos filled with gun smoke, shouting voices, and the crack of rifles echoing off canyon walls. Tom moved through the familiar terrain like a ghost made of vengeance and determination, his federal badge catching occasional gleams of sunlight as he carried law into places where corruption had grown comfortable in shadow. But in the confusion of combat, she made a choice that stopped his heart and changed everything about their tactical situation. Seeing one of the gunmen drawing a careful bead on old Pete from concealment behind a fallen log, she stepped between the rifle and its intended target, without hesitation or consideration for her own safety. The bullet took her in the chest, spinning her around and dropping her to the porch boards like a broken doll whose strings had been suddenly cut. The sight of her blood spreading across the weathered wood that Tom had hewn with his own hands sent a roar of rage through him that echoed off the mountainsides like thunder announcing the end of the world. Tom abandoned all pretense of tactical advantage to reach her, covering the open ground between his position and the cabin in bounds that would have impressed a mountain cat hunting deer. As he cradled her against his chest, feeling her life seeping between his fingers like water through a broken dam, the choice became crystal clear with the simplicity of natural law: justice or love, duty to a dead partner or commitment to a living woman. The killers were fleeing into the approaching storm, and every second he delayed made their escape more certain, made the possibility of legal justice more remote. But looking down at her pale face, feeling her breath flutter against his neck like the wings of a bird stunned by flying into glass, Tom knew there was really no choice at all. Some things mattered more than badges and vengeance, more than duty to the dead when the living needed saving. Let them run into the storm and the mountain's mercy. He had something infinitely more precious right here in his arms, something worth more than all the justice in the territorial courts. The killers could wait. She couldn't. Time moved thick as honey in January as Tom carried her into the cabin, her blood painting a trail across the clean floor he'd swept that morning with the domestic care of a man who'd found peace in simple routines. Her breath came shallow and quick. The bullet lodged somewhere beneath her ribs where his rough hands couldn't reach to provide the kind of healing that required surgical precision and medical knowledge he'd never possessed. "Stay with me," he whispered, pressing strips of clean cloth against the wound while thunder rolled across the peaks like artillery announcing the approach of celestial armies. "You don't get to leave now. Not when we're just getting started on the life we're building together." She opened her eyes, and in their depths he saw something that defied rational explanation. Not resignation or the kind of fear that comes with approaching death, but a peaceful knowing, as if she'd seen this exact moment approaching from miles away, and had been preparing for it with the patience of someone who understood that some endings were really beginnings in disguise. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm that was shaking the cabin's walls, "I need to tell you something I should have said before. I always knew when danger was close. Could feel it in my bones, like weather changing. That's how I survived so long after they killed the marshal." Through strength that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than physical reserves, she told him the truth he'd never suspected about the simple girl who couldn't speak properly. The fever that had supposedly stolen her voice had left her with something else in return, a way of reading hearts and sensing the darkness in men's souls before it showed on their faces or in their actions. It wasn't magic or witchcraft or any of the supernatural explanations the townspeople had whispered about her presence on the mountain. It was something more subtle and more powerful, an intuitive understanding of human nature that let her see past words and appearances to the truth that lay beneath social masks and comfortable lies. "That's how I knew to fear those men in the storm," she continued, her fingers barely strong enough to touch his cheek with the gentleness of morning mist. "And how I knew you were safe from the moment you offered your hand at that auction. Your heart was clean, Tom. Clean and lonely and looking for something to protect instead of something to own." She'd guided him to her that day, not through coincidence or luck, but through the kind of connection that exists between souls who recognize each other across the distances that separate most people from genuine understanding. "You found me because I called to you," she said, her voice growing fainter as her strength ebbed like water from a cracked vessel. "Not with words or gestures, with something deeper than speech." Outside, the storm was driving the fleeing killers toward the narrow canyon where Tom had set snares for winter hunting, funneling them into terrain that would test their desperation against the mountain's indifferent judgment. Nature itself seemed to be conspiring against men who'd grown comfortable with corruption, forcing them to face consequences in a place where money and influence carried no weight. The mountain was offering Tom a final choice between competing loyalties: pursue justice for William Hayes and the other victims of the conspiracy, or stay with the woman who'd become his entire world. But as he held her close, feeling her life ebbing away like warmth from a dying fire, she made the decision for him with the clarity that comes from seeing beyond present circumstances. "Go," she whispered, with an authority that came from somewhere deeper than physical weakness. "Finish what we started. I'll be here when you come back, not going anywhere without you." It was both a promise and a prophecy, spoken with the certainty of someone whose gift let her see paths that others couldn't perceive. Tom kissed her forehead, tasting salt and sorrow and the metallic tang of blood, then took up his rifle for what he hoped wouldn't be the last time. The storm had transformed the canyon into a trap more perfect than anything human planning could have devised. The fleeing conspirators found themselves caught between walls of stone and rising water, their expensive horses useless in the narrow confines where rocks turned every step treacherous and every shadow might hide a federal marshal seeking justice for his murdered partner. When Tom appeared above them on the canyon rim, silhouetted against lightning that illuminated him like divine judgment taking human form, the men below knew their years of running had finally ended. Their leader looked up through driving rain that had reduced his authority to nothing more than expensive clothes torn by thorns and mountain stone. "You can't prove anything in court, Marshal," Morrison shouted over the storm's fury, water streaming from his face, like tears he'd never shed for his victims. "It's our word against the ravings of a dead man and a girl who's probably bleeding out in your cabin right now." Tom's rifle never wavered from its target, steady as the mountain stone beneath his feet. "Ain't going to be my word that hangs you, Morrison. It's hers, and she's got more life left in her small body than you've got lies in that black heart." The confession came then, spilled out like poison from a lanced wound under pressure of approaching death, and the kind of fear that comes from finally facing consequences that can't be bribed or threatened away. Names, dates, bribes, and murders. A complete catalog of corruption that reached from Denver's finest hotels to the territorial Capitol building, where judges sold verdicts like commodities. Some of the men would face legal justice when the storm passed, and federal authorities could be summoned to collect evidence and testimony. Others faced the more immediate reckoning that the harsh country they'd chosen for their final crimes had prepared for men who thought themselves above natural law. When Tom returned to the cabin, dawn was breaking clear and cold over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson that promised fair weather after the night's violence. She was still breathing, still fighting, still holding on to life with the same quiet determination that had carried her through years of protective silence and careful hiding. As he knelt beside her and took her hand in both of his, feeling warmth that spoke of life continuing despite everything that had tried to end it, she opened her eyes and smiled with an expression that held no fear of what might come next. "Told you I'd be here," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been when he'd left her bleeding on the cabin floor. Justice had been served. Not perfect, perhaps, but honest in the way that mountain justice always was. And love had proved stronger than vengeance, more enduring than duty, more valuable than all the gold in Colorado territory. Spring came late to the high country that year, but when it finally arrived on warm breezes that carried the scent of wildflowers and new grass, it brought healing that went deeper than what any doctor could have provided with needles and thread. She recovered slowly, like the mountain itself, shaking off winter's grip one sunrise at a time, growing stronger with each day that added color to her cheeks and steadiness to her hands. The cabin felt different now, bigger somehow, despite its unchanged dimensions, filled with the sound of her voice as she regained not just the physical ability to speak, but the emotional willingness to be heard by a world that had given her precious few reasons to trust its intentions. She talked about simple things at first, the way morning coffee caught sunlight in the tin cup, how aspen leaves danced with wind currents, the deep satisfaction that came from watching bread rise beside a fire that represented home and safety. Each word was a small victory over the fear that had kept her silent through years, when speaking might have meant death, and Tom found himself treasuring every casual comment like other men hoarded gold or silver. More than that, he discovered his own voice again, sharing stories of his youth in Missouri, dreams he'd buried with Emma and James, plans for the future that no longer hurt to imagine, because they included someone who made tomorrow worth reaching for. They were learning to be partners in conversation as well as survival, building the kind of companionship that comes from choosing each other through circumstances that test the foundations of human connection. When the settlement preacher rode up in early May, Tom braced himself for another confrontation with narrow-minded judgment disguised as religious authority. But Reverend Walsh came bearing wildflowers, picked by the valley women, and an invitation that surprised them both with its simple generosity. "Folks would be honored if you'd let me perform a proper ceremony," he said, holding his hat in weathered hands that had comforted the dying and blessed the newborn through 20 years of frontier ministry. "Town owes you both an apology that can't be fully expressed in words and a debt that can't be repaid in silver. Figure the least we can do is witness you two choosing each other legal-like." The wedding took place on their expanded porch, with decorations of wildflowers and pine boughs, Old Pete providing fiddle music that danced with mountain wind, while a small crowd of genuine friends gathered to witness vows that had already been tested by fire and proven stronger than the forces that had tried to tear them apart. She wore a dress of blue cotton sewn by the women of Cedar Flats, their way of making amends for cruel words and crueler judgments that seemed like ancient history now that truth had been separated from gossip and fear from fact. When Tom slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, purchased with money earned through honest work instead of inherited through violence, she looked at him with eyes that held no shadows of the past, only light that promised a future worth building together. "I choose you too, Tom Brennan," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the valley like a bell announcing good news to anyone within hearing distance. The reward money for capturing Hayes's killers and breaking up the corruption network was substantial enough to change their lives in practical ways, sufficient to pay off her family's debts completely and provide resources for starting fresh without the weight of past mistakes dragging down their hopes. But more valuable than silver was the respect they'd earned from people whose opinions mattered, recognition that came from standing for principles that most folks claimed to believe, but few were willing to defend when defense required personal risk. When they came down to Cedar Flats for supplies, storekeepers offered fair prices and genuine smiles, children waved from doorways, and adults nodded with the kind of acknowledgement reserved for neighbors whose character has been tested and found solid. The transformation wasn't universal. Some people cling to prejudice like drowning men clutch driftwood, but it was sufficient to make their mountain home feel less like exile and more like chosen sanctuary. She used some of the reward money to build a small schoolhouse where she taught children who couldn't hear or speak in traditional ways, sharing communication skills that she developed through necessity and refined through years of observation. Her gift for reading hearts and understanding different kinds of expression made her a teacher whose influence reached families throughout the region, people who traveled considerable distances to learn from the woman who'd transformed silence into strength. Tom found himself trading regularly with townspeople who no longer saw him as the hermit of the mountain, but as a man whose word could be trusted and whose judgment was worth seeking on matters that required both practical knowledge and moral clarity. His skills as hunter and tracker were valued, his understanding of weather patterns respected, his reputation as someone who chose principle over convenience established beyond question. On quiet evenings, they sat together on their expanded porch, now wide enough for 2 chairs and the life they were building, one shared sunset at a time. The cabin had grown along with their relationship. New rooms added to accommodate the future they were creating through daily choices to build rather than simply survive. Their valley stretched out below them, peaceful as answered prayer, while night birds called to their mates and stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. They'd found what they'd been seeking without fully understanding what they were looking for, a place where broken things could heal, where silence could bloom into song, where home meant not just shelter from life's storms, but someone worth weathering them beside. "Home," she said one evening, as sunset painted the peaks in shades of purple and gold, her hand resting easy in his calloused palm. "Yes, ma'am," Tom agreed, watching smoke rise straight up from their chimney into still air that promised fair weather ahead. "Home. Now, I've told you this story not because it's got a perfect ending. Lord knows, life don't often hand those out like penny candy at a church social. Real life's messier than stories, full of loose threads and questions that don't get answered neat and tidy. I've told it because sometimes, in this hard old world we're living in, we need reminding that worth ain't measured by what society says you're good for." That mountain man, Tom Brennan, he could have walked past that auction platform like most folks do when they see suffering that ain't their direct problem, could have told himself it wasn't his business, wasn't his place to interfere with other people's family matters or the natural order of things. But he'd learned something up in those high places, something that comes from living close to the bone where pretense gets stripped away by wind and weather, and the simple necessity of surviving from one day to the next. He'd learned that the things that break us can also teach us how to mend others, if we're willing to let pain become wisdom instead of bitterness. And that girl, well, she knew something most folks spend their whole lives trying to figure out, if they ever do. She knew the difference between being quiet because you're afraid and being quiet because you're wise, between silence that comes from weakness and silence that comes from strength. She understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is hold your peace until you find someone worth breaking that peace for. See, we live in times when everybody's got something to say, when the loudest voice gets heard, and the gentlest gets drowned out in all the shouting. Social media and politicians, and folks with opinions about everything, competing to see who can make the most noise, who can get the most attention, who can convince the most people they've got all the answers to questions most of us are still trying to understand. But I'm here to tell you that the deepest truths often come whispered, and the strongest love grows quiet as mountain grass, steady as granite, sure as sunrise, lasting as the hills themselves. The kind of love that doesn't need to announce itself with grand gestures or fancy words, but proves itself through daily choices to see worth where others see waste, to offer shelter where others offer judgment, to choose loyalty where others choose convenience. That cabin's still up there, they say, though Tom and his wife have been gone from this world for nigh on 40 years now. Got windows that catch the morning light just right, and a garden where wildflowers grow between the vegetables, like beauty refusing to be separated from practical necessity. Got the sound of children's laughter when the grandkids come to visit in summer, and the kind of deep peace that settles on places where real love took root and grew strong. Maybe that's what we all need to remember when the world gets too loud and too cruel, when it seems like decent folks are outnumbered by the ones who measure everything by profit and power and what they can get away with when nobody's watching. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step forward with whatever you've got, whether it's silver dollars or simple kindness or just the willingness to see another person's dignity when everyone else sees only damage. In a time when folks are quick to write each other off, when a person's mistakes define them more than their efforts to make things right, when human value gets measured by all the wrong scales. Well, maybe we need more people willing to say, "I'll take them," when the world's ready to throw someone away. Not to own, but to honor. Not to use, but to protect. Not because it's easy or profitable or likely to win approval from the crowd, but because it's right. If this old story touched something in you, reminded you of what matters when everything else fades away, the kindness that costs nothing but gives everything, the strength that speaks softly, the love that sees worth where others see waste, well then, maybe you'd care to hear another tale about folks who found light in dark places. Because Lord knows, we got plenty more stories about the kind of courage that don't make headlines but makes all the difference in the world.